it was just another crisp, ordinary morning. The soft hum of the kettle boiling filled the kitchen as Emma stood by the counter, preparing breakfast. The sun had barely risen, casting a warm, golden hue through the windows. Her son, Ethan, sat at the kitchen table, his small hands carefully pushing his cereal bowl toward him. He was disabled, his movements slow, but there was an unmistakable determination in his eyes. Emma glanced at him, her heart swelling with love and an undeniable sense of protectiveness. Ethan had always been her world. He had been diagnosed with cerebral palsy when he was just a toddler, a condition that left him with limited mobility and speech difficulties. But despite his struggles, he had an unbreakable spirit that inspired Emma every day. She had learned to navigate life with him in ways that others couldn't understand, always staying vigilant, always aware of his needs. "All set for school, buddy?" Emma asked, her voice warm yet laced with the subtle undertone of concern she always carried for him. Ethan's lips parted in a smile, though he struggled to speak. He nodded, his eyes twinkling. He was proud to be going to school, to be learning with other kids, even if it wasn't always easy. Emma placed a plate of toast in front of him, giving him a quick peck on the forehead. "Don't forget your jacket, it's chilly outside." She moved to the fridge, taking out a juice box and handing it to Ethan before taking a seat across from him. A moment of silence settled between them, a comforting pause in their otherwise hectic routine. As Emma sipped her coffee, her mind flickered back to the previous evening. There had been a school meeting about new safety protocols. She had attended with a sense of duty, hoping to hear about the school's latest measures to improve safety for all children. But Karen, the new head of the HOA, had made an announcement about changes to the school policies that had left Emma uneasy. She'd spoken about increased security, new rules for visitors, and new surveillance cameras. All of it sounded reassuring at first, until she mentioned the stricter protocols for the science lab. From now on, only authorized staff will be allowed near the labs during school hours. The students must remain inside the classrooms unless they're under direct supervision, Karen had said. There was something in her tone, a rigidness that hadn't sat right with Emma. The way Karen's eyes narrowed as she spoke, almost like she was enjoying the power she now had over the school's operations. Emma couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the exchange had unsettled her. Shaking the thought from her head, Emma focused on Ethan again. He was so excited about school today, he'd been looking forward to a special science experiment. She smiled at him, brushing aside any lingering worries. "You ready for your experiment?" she asked, her voice light and encouraging. Ethan's face lit up, and he nodded enthusiastically. He had been talking about it all week. Today, he would get to mix chemicals and watch them bubble and fizz, a simple experiment, but one that brought him so much joy. With a final check of the clock, Emma helped Ethan into his jacket and grabbed his bag. "All right, kiddo. Let's get going." They stepped outside into the cool morning air, the quiet neighborhood still asleep, save for a few early risers walking their dogs. The school was just a few blocks away. As they made their way down the street, Emma couldn't help but notice the figure of Karen standing by the entrance to the school, her arms crossed, eyes scanning the arriving students. The HOA leader always seemed to be watching, always there with a calculating look in her eyes. "Have a great day, Ethan," Emma said, bending down to kiss him on the cheek before he made his way into the school. Ethan turned back, his smile bright, before he disappeared into the hallway, his backpack bouncing lightly against his shoulders. Emma watched him go, her chest tightening just slightly, a reflex she'd come to expect after years of always keeping an eye on him. Turning away from the school, she glanced back one more time. Karen was still standing at the entrance, talking to one of the teachers. Her presence was undeniable, commanding even from a distance. Emma shook her head, dismissing the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. There was no reason to worry, not yet. But little did she know, the calm of that morning would be the last she would feel before everything changed. The school bell rang, signaling the end of another hectic morning, and Ethan made his way to the science lab, his heart racing with excitement. Today, he would be helping his classmates with a hands-on science experiment, mixing chemicals to see how they reacted. It was the kind of task that had him thrilled, eager to prove himself in a room full of students who were just as excited to learn. His teacher, Mrs. Daniels, was standing at the door, greeting each student as they entered. She had a warm smile, the kind that made Ethan feel safe, like everything in the world would be okay as long as she was around. "Ethan, you're working with the lab group on the chemical reaction project today," she said, her tone bright and welcoming. Ethan nodded eagerly, though he had trouble speaking clearly at times. Mrs. Daniels didn't seem to mind. She had always been patient with him, never rushing him or treating him like he was different. The lab was just down the hall, a large room filled with metal tables, glass beakers, and shelves lined with jars containing all sorts of chemicals. Ethan had always been fascinated by the lab, its sterile, scientific feel. The smell of old books and cleaning agents hung in the air, and the sound of faint dripping water from a leaky faucet echoed throughout the room. There was a buzz of excitement as the students took their seats at the tables, their hands reaching for the various materials laid out in front of them. Ethan settled into his assigned seat, feeling the cool touch of the metal table beneath his palms. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the sight of the bright fluorescent lights overhead, their dull hum filling the space. His classmates were busy chatting, each of them ready to dive into the experiment. But something felt off. Karen was standing at the back of the room, her arms crossed, observing the students from a distance. She was no longer a teacher or a parent volunteer in the school, she was part of the HOA, now wielding some kind of quiet authority in the school's operations. Ethan had seen her around before, at meetings, school events, and always lurking just at the edges of things. She had a sharp, calculating gaze, and today, she seemed more present than usual. Karen didn't interact with the students directly. Instead, she lingered, like a shadow hovering over the classroom. She watched them with a quiet intensity, her eyes scanning the room in a way that made Ethan feel uncomfortable. Her presence was unsettling. Emma had never fully trusted Karen, even before she'd gotten involved with the HOA. There was something about her that just didn't sit right. Ethan couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a coldness about her, an aloofness that made the air feel heavier. As the class settled in, Mrs. Daniels began explaining the first part of the experiment. She was demonstrating how certain chemicals would react when mixed, and Ethan watched with fascination as the liquid swirled together, changing colors in front of his eyes. It was mesmerizing. "Ethan," Mrs. Daniels called, breaking him from his trance. "Why don't you assist with the next part? I need you to carefully add the sulfuric acid to this beaker." Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for the bottle, but he was focused, this was his moment to shine. He carefully poured the acid into the beaker, just as Mrs. Daniels had instructed, watching with delight as the liquid bubbled and fizzed. His classmates whispered excitedly, and he felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. But then, without warning, the door to the lab creaked shut. Ethan didn't notice at first, lost in the thrill of the experiment. But after a few moments, he felt a sudden unease. The door was usually left ajar to allow fresh air to circulate the room, but now it was closed. It felt wrong. His anxiety began to build, creeping up from his stomach to his chest. He looked over his shoulder. Mrs. Daniels was still engaged in explaining the experiment to the students, her back turned. Karen was nowhere to be seen, but the sense of something amiss lingered in the air. Ethan tried to push the feeling aside and focused on his task. But as the minutes passed, he began to feel it more acutely. The air in the room seemed heavier, thicker, as if it were closing in on him. The chemicals in the beaker bubbled with a soft hiss, and the sound of the fluorescent lights above buzzed louder, almost like a warning. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The room grew silent. Ethan stood up, slowly, his body tense. The anxiety was almost unbearable now. He glanced at the door again, still closed. His heart skipped a beat. The door, it wasn't locked, was it? He tried to push it open, but it didn't budge. Panic began to rise in his chest. He tugged harder, but it wouldn't open. His breathing quickened as he realized what was happening. He was locked in. The door was locked, and he was alone. He turned around to find Mrs. Daniels and his classmates still oblivious to his growing panic. The beaker in front of him seemed to mock his helplessness. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the smell of chemicals, stronger now, made his head spin. He didn't know what to do. His hands were clammy, and his legs felt like lead. He pressed his ear to the door, hoping to hear someone on the other side, but there was only silence. Karen's voice echoed in the hallway, distant and cold. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but the chill that ran down his spine told him everything he needed to know. He was trapped. The clock on the wall ticked with a slow, monotonous rhythm, its hands inching forward with an unbearable sense of foreboding. Ethan's hands trembled, sweat slicking his palms as he continued to tug at the door. His chest felt tight, and each breath he took seemed to get shorter, more panicked. The room was growing colder, the smell of chemicals stronger, mixing with the faintest acrid scent of something burning. Ethan turned away from the door, his heart pounding. The students at the other tables were still too engrossed in their work, blissfully unaware of the danger creeping around them. His gaze shot toward the windows. No, those would never open, not with the metal grating covering them. He could see the vague outlines of the trees outside, the faint movement of branches swaying in the breeze. He felt a surge of frustration. The thought of being trapped, the inability to do anything about it, made the walls feel like they were closing in around him. Panic clawed at him. His breaths grew shallow, each one coming faster than the last. His mind raced with questions. Why was the door locked? Why had Mrs. Daniels not noticed? The worst part, though, was the eerie silence that filled the room. It was a silence that weighed on him, thick and oppressive, the kind that made every sound feel too loud. The bubbling in the beaker seemed to echo, each hiss of steam cutting through the quiet like a warning. Then, there was a faint sound, a soft, almost inaudible scraping noise from the back of the lab. Ethan's head snapped toward the source, his eyes searching the room. He could see nothing out of the ordinary, but the hair on the back of his neck stood up. A gut feeling told him something wasn't right. It wasn't until he noticed Karen standing at the back of the room, her back turned to him, that he realized she was involved. She was bent over a counter near the chemical storage, her hand poised over a series of glass vials. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had seen her earlier in the hallway, her sharp eyes scanning the students, her presence somehow too commanding for comfort. But now, she was doing something that felt out of place. Karen's gloved hands moved with deliberate precision, her eyes flicking over the labels on the chemical bottles. She was holding a vial of sulfuric acid, its label clear and ominous. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What was she doing? Without a word, Karen poured the contents of the vial into a larger beaker, then set it down on the counter with a soft clink. She took a step back, her eyes narrowing with a strange satisfaction. Ethan's gut twisted as he watched her linger in front of the beaker, her expression unreadable. He could feel something in the pit of his stomach, the unmistakable sense of danger creeping closer. Then, with a calculated movement, Karen took a match from her pocket, striking it with a sharp flick of her wrist. The match ignited, and she carefully lowered it toward the beaker. The flame flickered for a moment, then touched the liquid in the glass container. A moment of stillness passed. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then the beaker erupted in a violent hiss. The liquid inside began to bubble violently, its surface rippling as if something inside it was alive, reacting to the fire. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the first wisps of smoke curled up from the beaker. It was too late. The fire had already begun. The flames, at first small, began to grow. The reaction between the chemicals was swift, too fast for anyone to realize what was happening until it was almost out of control. Smoke billowed upward, swirling in thick clouds that filled the lab. Ethan's eyes widened in horror as the fire continued to grow. The heat was intense, and the scent of burning chemicals filled the air, stinging his nose and making his throat close in panic. The students were still oblivious, too focused on their experiments, too caught in the haze of excitement. They had no idea that the situation was spiraling out of control. Ethan opened his mouth to shout, but his voice was drowned by the roar of the fire. He couldn't breathe. His lungs burned, and his body swayed on unsteady legs. The smoke was thick now, curling around him, blurring his vision. He stumbled backward, trying to find a way out, but the door was still locked. His mind raced for a solution, but each passing second made it clear that his chances of escape were slipping away. The fire was spreading quickly now, consuming the chemicals, and filling the room with a sense of impending disaster. The walls seemed to close in, the room shrinking around him with each desperate breath he took. As his fingers fumbled against the window, trying to force it open, the heat became unbearable. The glass shimmered from the intensity of the flames. His thoughts grew frantic, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. He couldn't stay here. He had to get out. Meanwhile, outside the school, Emma was already on edge. The strange sensation she had felt that morning hadn't left her. Every time she checked her phone, there was still no response from Ethan's school. She'd tried calling several times but was greeted by voicemail. Anxiety gnawed at her insides. Something didn't feel right. Her steps quickened as she neared the school, her pulse rising. She had already felt uneasy about Karen's presence at the school that morning, but now it was like a weight was pressing down on her chest. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she saw a group of parents gathered near the entrance, whispering in hushed tones. Emma approached one of the teachers, her voice shaking with urgency. "Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to keep her composure. The teacher looked at her with confusion, a strained smile on their face. "I'm not sure. There's been some sort of incident in the lab. We're waiting for the fire department." Emma's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat as she fought to process the words. "Is Ethan in there?" she demanded, her voice rising with panic. The teacher's face faltered, but before they could answer, a loud, echoing alarm rang through the school. The fire had spread faster than anyone could have imagined. "Where is my son?" Emma cried, her voice desperate. The teacher stepped back, her face pale. I'm not sure. We're still evacuating the classrooms." The tension was suffocating. Inside the lab, Ethan fought against the growing panic as the fire continued to rage. Outside, Emma's fear was now palpable, her every instinct telling her that her son was in danger. The fire had been set, and it was only a matter of time before everything went from bad to worse. The fire was no longer a mere flicker, it was alive, a ravenous beast devouring everything in its path. Flames clawed at the ceiling, their orange tongues licking the walls, sending thick plumes of black smoke billowing toward the high windows, obscuring everything. The chemical reactions had escalated too quickly, too violently. What had once been a controlled experiment was now a full-fledged inferno. Ethan could barely make out the shape of the lab through the thickening smoke. The air was growing heavy, suffocating, each breath feeling like it could be his last. His heart pounded in his chest, the rapid beat matching the urgency of his thoughts. His hands were shaking, and his legs felt like lead. His eyes burned from the smoke, and every breath he took was thick with the acrid stench of sulfur and burnt plastic. The heat was unbearable. It pressed against him, like a physical weight, making it harder to think. He staggered back, his arms outstretched, searching for any way out. But the lab was a maze of metal tables, shelves, and glass beakers, each of them swaying in the heat, each a potential hazard. His mind raced as he tried to calculate his next move, but the pain in his chest and the dizzying effects of the smoke made it difficult to focus. His disability, once an obstacle he had learned to live with, was now a cruel adversary. His movements were slower than they should have been, his limbs uncooperative in the chaos. The door. It was still locked. He tried again, pulling with all the strength his weak body could muster, but the door remained stubbornly immovable. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body fighting against the smoke and the panic that threatened to consume him. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. "Please," he whispered, though the words barely escaped his parched throat. "Please, someone, help me." His mind flashed to his mother, her warm smile, her comforting presence. He could almost feel her arms around him, holding him close, telling him everything would be okay. But in that moment, with the fire crackling in his ears and the smoke filling his lungs, it felt as if he were a million miles away from her. Outside, Emma was moving faster now, her heart in her throat. She had heard the sirens, the faint sound of the fire trucks in the distance, but it felt like they were too far away, too late. Every step she took toward the school felt like a step deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her phone, dialing the school's number for the 100th time. No answer. She burst through the school gates, her feet pounding against the pavement, her mind consumed with a single thought: where is Ethan? A teacher hurried past her, holding a child by the hand, their face pale, eyes wide with fear. Emma grabbed their arm, stopping them mid-step. "Where is my son? Where is Ethan?" she demanded, her voice thick with panic. The teacher's eyes darted to the building, then back to Emma. We're still evacuating the students. The fire started in the science lab, but I don't know where he is." Emma's chest tightened. "You don't know? How can you not know?" The teacher's expression faltered, and for a moment, Emma thought they might break down in front of her. But there was no time for that. There was no time for uncertainty or hesitation. Emma turned away, running toward the school entrance. She pushed past a group of teachers, her fear now a sharp, unrelenting ache in her gut. The door to the building was locked. Panic surged through her, a cold, paralyzing fear that threatened to crush her chest. She pulled at the door with all her might, but it wouldn't open. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. "No. No, no, no." A figure appeared behind her, Principal Taylor, his face grim, his eyes scanning the building with a worried, distant look. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice low and strained. "We've evacuated everyone, but we can't get to the lab. The fire's too intense. We're waiting for the fire department." Emma's world spun. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. "My son is still in there. Ethan is still in that lab. You need to let me in." Principal Taylor hesitated. "I can't let you in, it's too dangerous." "I don't care," she spat, her voice trembling with fear and rage. "My son is in there, and I'm going in." She shoved past him, ignoring his protests, her legs carrying her forward on pure adrenaline. The hallway felt endless, stretching out before her in a blur of chaos and smoke. She didn't know how she found her way to the science wing. She didn't know how her body kept moving, the fear propelling her forward, the need to find Ethan overwhelming everything else. Inside the lab, the flames were roaring, the smoke thickening with each passing second. Ethan's eyes were blurred, his throat raw as he stumbled through the room. He could barely see, could barely breathe, but his legs carried him forward, his body refusing to give up, refusing to let the fire consume him. He knew he couldn't die here. He couldn't let this be the end. He heard a loud crash as something fell, a glass beaker shattering against the floor. The fire was everywhere now, swirling, crackling, the air so thick with smoke that it felt like it was trying to suffocate him. He kept moving, his arms outstretched, his fingers grazing against the cold metal of the tables. Each step was a battle, his legs weakening, but he refused to stop. Then, through the haze, he heard it, a faint sound, a voice calling his name. At first, he thought it was a dream, a mirage brought on by the smoke, but the voice was getting louder. "Ethan." The voice, strong and full of desperation, cut through the chaos. His mother's voice. His heart leapt in his chest. He turned, his heart pounding in his ears. "Mom," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. A figure appeared through the smoke, Emma, her face pale and streaked with fear, her eyes locked on him. "Ethan," she cried, her voice breaking as she pushed forward, her hands reaching out for him. She staggered into the lab, her body lurching with every step, but she wasn't stopping. She wasn't giving up. "Mom," Ethan gasped again, his legs giving way as he fell to his knees. "Help me." Emma was there in an instant, her arms wrapping around him, pulling him close. She could feel the heat of the flames, the intensity of the fire licking at the edges of the room, but in that moment, all she cared about was her son. She held him tight, her hands trembling as she searched his face for any sign of injury, any sign of life. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice breaking with relief. "I'm here. We're getting out of here, okay? You're going to be okay." Tears welled in her eyes as she helped him to his feet, dragging him through the smoke and toward the door. The fire was still raging behind them, but she wouldn't stop. She couldn't. Not when Ethan needed her. The door was locked, the metal handle slick with heat. Emma kicked it, desperate, and finally, the door gave way with a deafening crash. She dragged Ethan out into the hallway, gasping for air, the smoke following them like an unwelcome shadow. The fire was still consuming the lab, still burning, but Emma's heart was no longer filled with panic. It was filled with something else now, relief. Relief that her son was in her arms, that she hadn't lost him. Not today. The fire had been extinguished, but its aftermath lingered in the air. The school was a charred shell of its former self, the once pristine hallways now tainted with soot, the windows shattered by the intense heat. The science lab, the scene of so much horror, was unrecognizable, a war zone of burnt-out equipment and blackened walls. But what was worse than the physical damage was the emotional toll it had taken on Ethan, and on Emma. Ethan had been taken to the hospital immediately after being pulled from the lab. His lungs were irritated from the smoke, his skin singed from the heat, but it was the look in his eyes that broke Emma's heart the most. The boy who had once been so full of life, so eager to explore the world, now lay in that sterile hospital bed, his face pale and his body tense with fear. But despite his injuries, Ethan was alive. That was the one thing Emma could cling to, the one thing that kept her from falling apart. Yet, it wasn't enough. Not when she knew that someone, somewhere, had allowed this to happen. Someone had made sure that her son had been trapped in that burning lab. Someone had orchestrated this nightmare, and Emma would make sure they paid for it. The night after Ethan was discharged from the hospital, Emma sat in her living room, her mind racing as she sifted through the details of the day. Her hands trembled as she held a file from the school, a report on the fire. The official narrative was vague, offering little in terms of concrete answers. It blamed faulty equipment, claimed the fire was an accident, and moved quickly to absolve the school and its staff of any responsibility. But Emma could sense the lies behind the carefully worded statements. She turned the page, her gaze falling on the names listed as witnesses to the fire, teachers, staff members, and, of course, Karen. The HOA leader's name stood out, and Emma's stomach churned with a familiar sense of unease. Karen had been there, and she had been the one to lock Ethan in that lab. Emma had seen her that morning, lurking in the background, looking like a shadow over everything. Emma's blood boiled as she replayed the scene in her mind, the moment when she'd seen Karen standing by the chemical storage, acting strangely. She could picture the exact moment when Karen had dropped the match into the beaker, the look of satisfaction on her face as the fire took hold. Emma had no proof yet, no solid evidence, but she knew deep down what had happened. The next morning, Emma didn't waste a second. She was up before dawn, making phone calls and scheduling meetings. First, she contacted the school's administration, demanding answers. She wanted to know exactly how the fire had started, who had been responsible for locking Ethan in, and why the safety measures in the lab had failed so catastrophically. The response was predictable: a meeting would be set up, but only after some time had passed for the dust to settle. Emma's requests for transparency were met with resistance. The principal was too busy. The district's legal team needed to review everything. But Emma wasn't one to back down. That afternoon, she found herself standing in the principal's office, her fists clenched by her sides, her body taut with the tension that had been building since the fire. Principal Taylor sat behind his desk, the usual calm demeanor gone, replaced with a look of concern and wariness. "I'm sure you understand the need for a thorough investigation," Principal Taylor began, his voice placating, as if trying to calm the storm brewing in Emma's eyes. "We are cooperating with the fire department and local authorities to determine what went wrong." "Don't give me that," Emma snapped, cutting him off. "My son nearly died in that fire. I don't need excuses. I need answers. Who locked him in? Who made sure he couldn't get out? Who allowed that chemical disaster to happen in the first place?" The principal's eyes darted briefly to the corner of the room, where a few school board members were seated, looking uncomfortable. They shifted uneasily under her gaze, but no one spoke up. Emma felt her resolve harden. She could already feel the weight of the system pressing against her, trying to bury the truth. Karen wasn't just a member of the HOA anymore. She was part of the school's inner workings, tied to every decision, every policy. Emma had seen her at meetings before, heard whispers about her rise to power in the school's PTA and beyond. There was no way that Karen wasn't involved in this. "I want to speak with Karen," Emma demanded, her voice low and controlled, but filled with an undeniable fury. "I want her to explain why she was near that chemical storage, and why she's been involved in the decision-making at this school. I want her to answer for what happened to my son." The room went silent. Emma could feel the pressure building in the air. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, their discomfort palpable. Principal Taylor's gaze faltered. "Karen's not here right now," he said, his voice tight. "She's away for a few days. But rest assured, we'll get to the bottom of this." Emma could tell it was a stall tactic, a way to buy time, but she wasn't going to let them play her for a fool. She stood up, her eyes hard as steel. "This isn't over," she said, her voice calm, but with a coldness that made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably. "You've given me no answers, no real investigation. I will be taking this further. I'll be filing a lawsuit if I don't get the answers I deserve. You're not going to sweep this under the rug." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but Emma wasn't waiting for their approval. She had made her decision. She was done waiting for the system to protect her son. She would take matters into her own hands. As she walked out of the principal's office, her heart still pounding in her chest, she knew one thing for sure: this fight was far from over. She would find the truth, no matter how deep she had to dig. And she would make sure that Karen and anyone else responsible for the fire would pay for the pain they had caused her son. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet. The heavy air felt thick with the weight of everything that had led to this moment: the fire, the lies, the fear, and the unwavering determination that had brought Emma here. The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the chamber, signaling the beginning of the final stretch in this battle for justice. Emma's hands were steady as she clutched the file in front of her. The evidence, phone records, testimonies, a trail of small yet undeniable connections, was all laid bare on the table. It had taken everything she had to get to this point: late nights sifting through documents, interviews with witnesses, hours spent planning her strategy. But now, she was here, facing the woman responsible for everything that had nearly destroyed her son's life, Karen. Karen sat across from her, her once calm demeanor now replaced with a noticeable tension. The confident facade that had shielded her throughout the entire ordeal had cracked. She sat rigidly, her fingers tapping nervously against the table, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. For all the power she had held over the school and its policies, in this room, Karen was just another defendant, a person who had to answer for the chaos she had caused. Emma's gaze never wavered from Karen. The past few weeks had been filled with doubts and sleepless nights, but now, in this moment, she felt more certain than ever. The fire had been no accident. Karen had played a role in it, whether by pushing for tighter security measures, ensuring that Ethan was locked in that lab, or by deliberately creating the conditions that would lead to the disaster. The evidence was clear, and now, Karen would have to face the consequences. "Your Honor," Emma began, her voice clear and unwavering, "I stand before you not just as a mother, but as a person who will stop at nothing to seek the truth and hold those accountable for the harm done to my son. Karen, the actions you've taken, the decisions you've made, they've not only put my son's life at risk, but they've caused irreparable damage to the very institution you claim to protect." The room was silent, everyone's eyes fixed on Emma. Her words rang out, a truth that could not be ignored. Karen's defense lawyer stood and objected, but Emma wasn't about to let the interruption derail her. The moments leading up to this had been a blur of interviews, court filings, and tense exchanges, but now, she was in control. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew was coming next. "I'm not here to argue semantics or pretend this was anything less than what it was, negligence, and worse, a deliberate act that endangered a child's life," Emma continued, her voice now a mixture of sorrow and righteous fury. "You, Karen, you knew what you were doing when you locked my son in that lab. You knew the chemicals in that room were dangerous, and you knew the lab's security system was vulnerable. And yet you allowed it to happen." The lawyer tried to speak again, but Karen held up a hand, silencing him. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting between Emma and the judge, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. Not anymore. The walls had come crashing down around her, and the truth was too glaring to hide from. "I have no reason to hide anymore," Karen finally spoke, her voice cold but betraying a hint of something darker. "Yes, I played a part. But it wasn't supposed to go this far. I didn't mean for it to happen. I thought it was just a safety measure. A precaution." Emma felt a knot in her chest tighten. It was the first time Karen had admitted any involvement, but it wasn't enough. The damage had already been done. A precaution? Emma's voice rose, and she leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Karen's. "Your precaution nearly killed my son. You locked him in there, knowing that the lab was filled with hazardous chemicals, knowing there was a lack of oversight. You played your role in this, Karen. You can't pretend you didn't." Karen's face twisted for a moment, a mix of anger and shame clouding her expression. "I was doing what I thought was right. The lab had too many people coming and going. The security needed to be tighter. I just wanted to keep everyone safe." "Safe?" Emma's voice broke as she stood tall, her fists clenched. "Your idea of safety almost got Ethan killed. What if he hadn't gotten out? What if you hadn't made those decisions? You had control, and you used it to trap him." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Karen's eyes flickered toward her lawyer, then back at Emma, but she said nothing more. The dam had broken, and the truth was finally out in the open. The judge, who had remained mostly silent throughout the exchange, cleared his throat and spoke. "It's clear that there was gross negligence in this case. The consequences of such actions are severe, and the law must take its course." Emma didn't look away from Karen as the judge issued his ruling, but a weight lifted off her shoulders. The truth had been acknowledged. Karen's role in the fire, her manipulation of the school's policies, the lock-in, everything had been exposed. The gavel came down with a final, resonant strike. The room buzzed with murmurs, but Emma was quiet, her breath steady now, her heart still pounding. She turned to Ethan, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, his face full of hope and uncertainty. He smiled softly, his small but strong presence a reminder of everything she had fought for. Karen was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her future uncertain. Emma didn't watch her go. Her focus was on Ethan now, the son who had survived the fire, who had shown courage she could only admire, who was now finally going to be able to heal. As Emma walked to the back of the room to meet him, she felt a surge of emotion. Ethan had come so far, and so had she. This battle had changed them both, but it had also brought them closer. Their bond was stronger than ever, forged in the fires of tragedy and the pursuit of justice. When Emma reached Ethan, she crouched beside him, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "We did it, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We got the truth. You're safe now." Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. He had been through so much, but now, the storm had passed. There was still a long road ahead for healing, but this was the beginning of the end of their suffering. Emma held him close, feeling his heartbeat against her own, and as she whispered a promise into his ear, she knew she would do anything to protect him, no matter what came next. "We're going to be okay, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "We're going to be okay." And for the first time in a long time, Emma truly believed it.